And in return, the association would give the patron social capital. And that often came in form of an honorific inscription and the Gaianus inscription in my article is a great example of an honorific inscription. The Christ group, is producing this inscription to thank Gaianus, but this is valuable for him, for Gaianus. It's not the case of this that sometimes gets argued, that these patrons could be very tyrannical. I'm sure they could be, but that it was a very kind of one-way street. It is a symbiotic relationship here between the recipients and the patron, because the patron is also dependent on the social capital and the public honor. And the public honor in the Roman Empire, that was like what the whole place ran on. So this is very important social capital, public honor.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Rebecca Runesson, and we'll be discussing an article of hers from the Journal of Biblical Literature that takes archaeological discoveries and larger social concepts that are illuminated from those discoveries and how that's applied to biblical texts in the New Testament, and how that is helpful in understanding the early Jesus movement in the greater context of the ancient Roman Empire. I think this kind of conversation is really fun because you get to get a peek behind the curtains of what was happening in the world, and maybe even get a better understanding of how you were taught something that's representing the ancient world through the lens that we have of our world. It's always nice to develop a more thorough understanding, or at least take a crack at developing a more thorough understanding of a world that we don't live in. Please let me know if you have any guest suggestions, feedback for me, or if you just want to hurl spears at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Rebecca Runesson. Rebecca Runesson, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me. What a treat to get to talk about what I'm always thinking about.
That's the point of the podcast for me. Before we do get going, though, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I am a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. My supervisor is John Kloppenborg. I am currently living in Sweden, where I am just finishing up my dissertation. I have 2 kids, so I'm either working or I'm running around with my boys, who are very energetic. So that's what my life looks like.
Okay, so I'm excited about this. This is a very interesting topic, and it's one of the. So we were talking about Wally Sirafesi, who I interviewed a couple of weeks ago.
Yes.
And it's one of those off the beaten path, which is, it seems like Gospels stuff. It's not quite as straightforward, just theology, which is what some of the other New Testament stuff feels like. So we're going to be talking about your article from the Journal of Biblical Literature, Centurions in the Jesus Movement, Rethinking Luke 7, 1 through 10, in light of the Gaianus inscription at Kefar Othnay. Please correct any pronunciations in there.
No, that was very good. That was very good. I'm impressed. Those are very tricky words.
Thank you. You must be a good teacher, because you're making a guy who needs to learn a lot feel pretty good about himself.
Thanks.
So what happens in Luke 7, 1 through 10? I guess we'll start there.
Yeah, great. Luke 7, 1 to 10. It's one of those pericopes, the healing pericopes in Luke. It begins with a centurion who he has a slave that he values highly, who is sick and close to death, as what Luke describes. When he hears about Jesus, he doesn't go himself, but instead he sends just what is described in the text as some Jewish elders to him and asks Jesus to come and heal his slave. And when they come to Jesus, there's this sort of conversation that happens where these elders are depicted as appealing to Jesus, describing why this man is worthy for Jesus to perform this miracle for him. And some of the reasons that they list is that he loves our people and he built our synagogue for us. That those are key, very I think that's probably why I've always loved this pericope. It is so interesting how this man is related to the community, and that really comes forth in this appeal. So after Jesus and the elders have talked, Jesus agrees to go with them, but he never has to enter the centurion's house. The centurion sends friends out to tell Jesus, Lord, he says, do not trouble yourself. I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof. Just say a word and let my servant be healed. And this phrase is pretty well known. Both this comes up in like liturgies too, I think, in churches, this phrase. Yeah. And when Jesus hears this, he is amazed by his faith and heals the servant or the slave. So that's what's happening in the story. There's a few different sort of there's a lot of moving parts here, right? I think when I first read this from an academic perspective, the first thing I thought about was that they never have to meet. Luke puts in a lot of different kind of narrative events that mean that the centurion and Jesus never actually meet. And that is an interesting thing. Why can't they meet? Why don't they meet? The other thing that is fascinating is, of course, this sort of appeal that the Jewish elders, they make on behalf of the centurion, that he is actually worthy of you for you to do this for him. And the reason is that he loves our people and he built our synagogue. And of course, this portrays the centurion as a patron. That's my kind of entrance into this passage, because I'm very interested in patronage and benefaction in antiquity. And so here we have a centurion benefactor or a centurion patron. And that sort of activity that he carries out is also given as a reason as to why he is worthy of Jesus doing this for him. Yeah, I think that's the main things that are relevant to the article that are going on. It's a very rich passage. People have approached it from many different perspectives. That's my interest in it.
So you mentioned that the centurion's like a patron or a benefactor,
Yeah.
they mark out social status. So
Yes.
it's this thing. So I know I mentioned it in the questions that I sent to you. My knowledge of that just is limited to 20 years ago. I read John Chow's book. I have no idea. And I think that book is 30 years old now.
It's a great book.
Okay. So still relevant. Good.
You got to read Patronage and Power. Yeah.
I worried though that it's been so long since I read it and it's been so long since the book was written that a whole lot has changed in the field. I guess maybe the best place to start, because one of the next questions I had. Okay, so what is a centurion? Where do they fit within military status?
Yeah.
Where do they fit within broader social civilian status? And then how does that apply to this community that he's in or he's located with?
Yeah, so this is such an interesting. Centurions as literary characters, they come up a lot, are so interesting because socially they were sort of the highest ranking officer that a local civilian person in the provinces was likely to come across. So a centurion in a way is, when depicted in literature, almost can become this sort of like image of empire sometimes, or imperial rule, because they were often in these like smaller provincial towns, which is what we're dealing with here, obviously, in Capernaum. A centurion was likely the highest ranking member of the army or of the kind of imperial system that you would come across. But so in a way, they are extremely high ranking in the social setting of a place like Capernaum. But in the army, they're a middling rank. So the army, I think, maybe not super helpful to go through the entire ranking system of the Roman army, but a centurion was a leader of a century, which is a subunit in the army. Very important such unit. They commanded a number of men, and there were different ranks of centurions as well. And you could have, there were a number of centurions within a legion, and of them there was you could move through the ranks and become the primus pilus, which was like the highest ranking centurion, for example. So even within the rank of the centurionate, there's a great deal of diversity in terms of the lower ranking centurions and the higher ranking ones. But if you just take like a cut of the mill centurion, we're talking like the core to the authority structure of the military, because they serve this incredibly important middling role in terms of communicating between the troops in the century and the higher ups that are making more of the important calls. Interestingly, many soldiers, when they produce inscriptions, when they identify themselves, we're talking legionaries here, so they would have the lowest, like foot soldier. They will often identify themselves as who is their centurion. And so legion, and this was my centurion. So it was important for a soldier's identity as well, like who was their centurion, who was their leader. So I hope that answers the question. So it's a middling officer role. They have a great deal of authority within the structure of the Roman legion, but they're not like the highest. They're not in the highest kind of category. But if you work yourself up, if you work through the promotional like ranks of the centurionate, you can get really high. So it's like an opening door to social progression within the army. But I think importantly for the context of my paper is that the centurion is, because of how the Roman army was structured when they were stationed in the provinces, the centurion was the highest ranking officer of the army that a civilian was likely to come across. You're not likely to say hi to a legate if you're it was the highest commander of an army of the legion. You're not likely to come across a legate as a normal, let's say like middle class civilian in the provinces. But you could meet a centurion because they played a role in tax collection. So the centurion becomes important in literature produced about the army. There's a lot of portrayals of centurions in literature about the military.
So I think that
was super long. I'm so sorry. You told me I could just keep talking, so I did. But you can always cut me off and interrupt me if something that I say sparks an interest.
No, why would I do that? There might be like 3 people who are listening to hear what I have to say. I'm married to one. The other one raised me. Okay.
Love that.
And I'm being generous with the third. So I'm thinking I remember seeing the documentary Restrepo, which was about a unit in Afghanistan, a U.S. Army unit in Afghanistan. And their captain, their company commander would go to a shura, which is like a meeting with the local elders. Mm-hmm. And there were some discussion as a way to find out what are some more diplomatic, non-military solutions to problems. And it sounds like you're talking about maybe that level. And I understand, like I'm not saying give me the equivalent to what the pay grade would be, and but functionally they're close enough to the local population that they need to establish relationships, which is what I feel like your paper is predicated on. This article is predicated on the idea that they're establishing relationships with the local community, particularly this one paid for the synagogue.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are 2 kind of schools in Roman military history in terms of that view differently how the army interacted with local civilians. There's definitely, and I think this was more the traditional school, which believes that the Roman army was like a kind of saran wrapped little social bubble that just popped up where they needed to in the provinces, but they didn't really interact that much with the civilians, and they didn't really become in any cohesive way part of the societies in which they were stationed. And that was like the prevailing view. And in the 90s, we have Richard Alston, Soldier and Society in Egypt, great, and several other scholars, but I think this was a great breakthrough study that sort of show through papyrological evidence and other types of material evidence how deeply enmeshed soldiers were with where they were stationed. That it's this kind of saran wrapped little military bubble. It's not really how it worked. And I think your example is interesting there because that example is from an active combat area situation where there's active hostilities around. And I have not looked at how civilians and soldiers interacted in settings in conflict during active conflict. I think that the evidence would be difficult to find an exact equivalent. But what's interesting is how they functioned as part of the societies when it was peacetime. Because I think we forget that the majority of the time they were not fighting. The majority of the time they were hanging out, building roads. You catch me? Like, they're part of the society that they're in. They're contributing to the economy, oftentimes in terms of building roads. The army included a large number of engineers. They are producing economic stimulation because of the things that they need to function. They need clothing, food, livestock, etc., etc. And so they need a means to bring that to them. So ergo roads. You also have other types of like trade and merchants that travel with or that kind of establish themselves in and around military camps. Even just that kind of a brief foray into it, you can't imagine that type of structure, right, without some sort of civilian engagement. And interestingly, I think when you look at the eastern provinces of the empire, I think Benjamin Isaac was one of the first to note this, that these legions were garrisoned to cities in a different way or more common than in the western provinces. So that means that these legions, they set up camp, if you will, like in and or very close to pre-existing cities or towns. And that's actually what Kefar Othnay is. There's a legion that's garrisoned there. And Jura Europos, which is in modern-day Syria, another very popular example. And so in those cases, you have quite a bit of give and take, I think, between military and civilian communities because they're living together and they're living side by side. And they're sharing city life in antiquity, like the things that need to happen to make a city work in antiquity, trade and different occupational groups and different things that, they're being shared by these legions and the civilians. And I think that creates a great degree of crossover. Yeah.
So there's a kind of immediate need to establish functional relationships with the local population. And we don't need conflict to drive our everyday relationships, but how does that also benefit like larger strategic goals of the empire?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's some debate on like Romanization as like this, which is just the spread of Roman culture, spread of Latinization of the provinces, the spread of Latin, and whether or not the Roman army as they moved around were a driver or of Romanization. And I think to some degree it would be hard to say that they were not. I think they clearly were. But I also think that there are so many soldiers that continue producing inscriptions in Greek, auxiliaries that are producing things in Greek, and they do take Latin names often when they are recruited if they don't already have them. But I think you can maybe question the degree to which a Latinization it did. A Latinization did. But I think you also I think that you should be careful in terms of thinking that the army was a huge driver of Romanization or a huge driver of Latinization. I think they definitely were. But the Roman military was also half made up of auxiliaries, which are non-Roman citizens who join these auxiliary units, they're called. They're not called legions. They're the equivalent to a legion, but they're not made up of citizens. And this is an example of how they do create Romanization, because these men would join up. They're non-citizens. They're not Romans. They join, they serve their 25 years, and if they are honorably discharged, they receive Roman citizenship, which is a huge perk, obviously. And so the military is producing Roman citizens, so it Romanizes in that way. But the auxiliaries are also bringing their cultures and their languages into these units. So I think both things are happening simultaneously, if that makes sense. That the army spreads its Roman culture, but also because there's such a dependence on non-Roman or non-citizen soldiers, it also works to absorb non-Roman culture, if that makes sense. And you see that in the spread of elective cults and such when they enter the army, that these soldiers are very like cultically curious. Does that make sense?
Okay, so that kind of makes me think about, you talk about the nature of the relationship determining how things are spread, or can we go into that, how you discuss that in the article?
Yeah, definitely. Are you referring to, and this is tricky stuff, but are you referring to the weak ties versus strong ties and the type of ideas?
Yes.
that can be spread. Yes. Yeah. So this is I personally, my supervisor introduced me to this way of thinking or this methodology, and I super fascinated and interested by it. So if you look at, there's a lot of sociological research that revolves around the spreading of ideas, right? Like how, also the spread of like diseases and things like that. But so for example, like how an idea of, I don't know. Oh, a great example. The only one that comes in my mind now is like circumcision as an HIV treatment type thing, where that's a spread of an idea that you can get. So obviously that's a hard one to adopt. So there's a whole study that Damon Santola did, which talks about ideas that are harder to spread. Which ideas are easier to spread in which settings, and which ideas are harder to spread in certain settings. So you can see, so there's a lot of interest in, obviously, in how to spread health related idea, like public health care, ideas about public health and things like that. So there's a lot of interesting research. For example, how do you spread like vaccine awareness, right? That's something that I'm sure everybody has a thought about or has been relevant to all of our pandemic and post-pandemic lives.
I was like, what are you
Yeah.
talking about? Where are you getting this idea
Yeah.
from?
No, but the idea that governments had to think about how they spread information about vaccines during the pandemic. And even if we back it up and we don't talk about vaccines, let's say we talk about even thinking about how do you spread ideas about social distancing, or how do you teach little kids in daycare how to wash their hands? That was a thing, how to wash their hands very effectively. That was a thing at the beginning of the pandemic. So I think public health issues are a great starting point, because I think we can all relate to them, like when we think about these difficult things like weak ties and strong ties. So, for example, if a daycare is like a great, not just because I'm a mom to like little kids, but I think that a daycare is a great example of this, because it is just like a virus hotspot, right? So you have just a lot that spread. It's easy to pick up a cold at a daycare. These kids are acting in a way where illnesses spread easily, and they have strong ties to each other. They are physically close to each other often. They are friends. They see each other every day. Things like a cold, for example, will spread very easily in those settings. But how do you spread, but even like weak ties, like kids that are in different part of the daycare, right? So you have one group with 1 to 2 year olds, and then you have another group with a preschool age. Those kids can also infect each other, because it doesn't take that much to get infected by a disease or a cold. But when you are teaching these kids how to protect themselves, like the public health information about washing hands, about social distancing and things like that, takes a strong tie connection to pass that type of knowledge to one person, from one person to another. Does that make sense? Because, and I think children are a great example, because a child is not just going to listen to anyone, right? So you're going to have, like their teacher can teach them about these things. I feel that I'm not explaining this in the best way, but does that make a little bit of sense at least?
Yeah, no, I understand. I
Okay.
mute my mic. That's why if you're not getting a lot of, if you're not hearing a lot of feedback from me, I mute my mic so that I don't interrupt you a ton.
Good. Yeah.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So I guess relating this to the Gaianus inscription, understanding what social networks look like
Yeah.
in that world. Does that?
Yes. Yeah. So the question that becomes interesting is how and this might be a little controversial, but imagine that the Christ cult or Christianity is a disease. And then you say, and this is just for the sake of thinking, how does this contagion pass from one person to another person? Or how does this idea spread? So that's what we're doing. When we apply these sociological models, they often are dealing with like how diseases spread, or how public health information to combat diseases, which are harder to adopt than the disease, how they spread. And then what you do is that you tweak and change the method to suit the data set. And then you're dealing with an idea, a belief system, which is their ideologies. They're not diseases, and so you have to make some tweaks to the method. But the basic question is, how does the centurion come into contact with and adopt in some form, or associate with, whatever you want to call it, with the Christ cult? And I think that's a very interesting question because around the year 230, we would know when this inscription was, when it was dated to by the excavators. And there's numismatic finds, so it's a secure date. That's early. That's not when we expect to see a centurion being called brother. That's what it says in the... So to just back up, for those who haven't read the article, the inscription says, I don't know if I know it by heart yet, but it says that the centurion Gaianus, also called Porphyrius, made the roof, the ceiling, the floor, the mosaic floor, our brother, he's called. So it's an honorific inscription honoring the centurion for donating the funds that enabled them to build a mosaic floor. And he's referred to as a centurion, our brother. And this is in a purpose-built, Christ-associated meeting hall, which is just a fancy way of saying like very early church, although it's tricky to use the term church for this time period. It's anachronistic. You've spoken with Wally. You've probably heard a very good explanation for why you can't use this terminology. It's very long and hyphenated, the alternative, but hopefully it saves us on
we actually went more into what the nature of a synagogue was, but it did touch on the idea like this is a public space, and that kind of, I think, blends in with what you're saying here about the nature of what these relationships are. That yes, he's done this thing, this benefit, this act of benefaction. He has done this, and yes, they express their gratitude, and they use this term for him, but he's not necessarily involved in what goes on in that public meeting space. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so there are different ways to understand the usage of the term brother, adelphos here. If the term adelphos, if they never called him brother, I think this inscription would kind of very clearly be the case, or it would be much easier to identify this centurion as what I would call an external patron. And we can talk a little bit about, we never got into patronage when we brought that up earlier, but
U-turn.
There's different...
U-turn. Let's go get it.
Yeah, U-turn. Let's go back. Because patronage, you can say patronage or benefaction. Let's just say patronage and use the term patronage the whole time because it is easier and less confusing. But
I feel like we're sticking it to the man. Are we sticking it to the man?
We are. When we're going to go patron, we're going to go Latin. Usually people use benefactor to talk about the Greek term of
But not here. Not today.
No, we're going Latin. It's the army. We're talking army, so we're going Latin. Okay. Yeah. So we'll do patron. So there were different ways that you could be the patron to an elective cult, which the Christ cult is an example of an elective group, an association. And I'm sure when you spoke to Wally, you were talking about different types of synagogues. He probably also mentioned the difference between an association and a public synagogue. Yes. So a little bit, he touched on it. Yeah. An association basically is an elective group. So it's a group you could choose to be a part of. An example that I think is easy to grasp right away for us today is a guild, like an occupational association. So basically just a like semi-public, semi-private space that existed in antiquity where people got together for various reasons to do various things. Often there was a funerary aspect, so they took care. There's no like social security in the ancient world, right? Associations were a type of security for people. You paid a little membership fee, and in many cases they took care of your burial when you died. Or for example, for trade, for guild, like a guild, quote unquote, like an occupational association, there were obviously benefits to be a part of that. And you can question how elective it was even. Almost everyone was a part of one for their chosen profession. And that obviously helped in their professional career. And it also made the work. And then you also have cultic associations, of which the Christ groups are an example. Jewish groups as well, synagogues, or you can any member, Aphrodite, Dionysiac groups are well known, Mithras, etc., etc. These are elective cults. So you can choose whether or not to be part of them. They're elective. It's not like the imperial cult or some of these polis level, these city level that sort of you almost had to be a part of, like the deity of a city that you had to be a part of to keep everything safe and secure for the empire or the city. But these groups, they often had patrons because there's no social security in the ancient world. They need money from somewhere. There was a few ways that they paid for their activities that often involved funerary kind of things for members. Almost always they ate together, like a banquet. They also sometimes went on little trips together, which always look so cute in the papyrological evidence, like everyone's going to this excursion to the city tomorrow. They could also, and then various for occupational associations, various sort of things that had to do with regulating the market for whatever field they were in. This takes money, right? So often people were paying a small amount of membership fee, but often there was also a patron involved. And a patron was then of a wealthier socioeconomic class than the association that we're talking about, which could exist on a spectrum of like high to low. But the patron was always one step ahead. And there's some good research that shows that they're not actually paying for such a huge amount. They're usually not donating this kind of huge amount that we think when we see all these honorific inscriptions in antiquity. I think there's pretty good evidence that they're actually contributing to maybe one or to five banquets for the group a year, which is not that much, like on par on average. But they are very visible to us in the evidence because the kind of dynamic between a patron and an association, or like a patron and a recipient of the patronage, was that the patron would give like monetary value. So they would donate funds, et cetera, or maybe donate the use of their house, or that happens quite a lot as a meeting space. And in return, the association would give the patron social capital. And that often came in form of an honorific inscription. And the Gaianus inscription in my article is a great example of an honorific inscription. The Christ group, is producing this inscription to thank Gaianus, but this is valuable for Gaianus. It's not the case of this that sometimes gets argued, that these patrons could be very tyrannical. I'm sure they could be, but that it was a very kind of one-way street. It is a symbiotic relationship here between the recipients and the patron, because the patron is also dependent on the social capital and the public honor. Public honor in the Roman Empire, that was like what the whole place ran on. So this is very important social capital, public honor. And that's given to these patrons by these honorific inscriptions. And you even find some that I love. Epigraphy is so much fun, first of all. There's some inscriptions where you can see that the association, they're aware of their power, even if they are on a lower kind of socioeconomic rung and they're receiving patronage. You can see in some inscriptions that they know that they also have something valuable to give. There's one example from Egypt, which I just love, where an association is writing about all the things that they do for their patrons or for their patron. And they get honored on this feast day. They crown a statue of him, all these kind of things that give public honor to this individual. And then they write at the end, and if he wanted to give a little bit more money, another day would be celebrated for him. So you see, they're working, right? Like they understand they have something valuable also to offer. So I think that, this Ono van Neef is the one to check out for this kind of relationship, the symbiotic nature of the relationship to this. But I think it is fascinating. So that's where patronage is today. You asked about patronage studies now versus 30 years ago. This is where we are now. And this is, again, Latin. We did Roman patronage. We're going to stay away from the Greek stuff for now, even though it's not irrelevant to the matter at hand, but it's maybe a bit much to tackle. Yeah.
I'm thinking of, I don't know, sometime maybe 20, 25 years ago, the YMCA in Katy, Texas, near where I live, was called the Kenneth Lay YMCA. And I don't know if that name rings a bell. Do you know who Ken Lay was?
I don't.
The CEO of Enron. It is not called the Kenneth Lay.
To know that, but yes. Yeah, that's a great example.
So he, being materially wealthy, not being sufficient to social status, he donated a sum of money to build a new YMCA facility out in Katy, Texas, in the west side of Houston. And then as soon as his fall, that name was removed. But so I brought because he can't donate a little bit more.
Oh, yeah.
It probably wasn't as easy to sandblast things in the ancient world, though.
Yeah, maybe not sandblasting, but they do this thing where Commodus, for example, the emperor, was very unpopular afterwards, and they will take his name out from inscriptions later. I'll X it out.
Just like scratch, like just line through it, or remove that portion of the inscription.
Scratch it out. Remove it. Scratch out the name. There's a name for this, but it happens. It happens. Like the Soviet pictures where they remove Trotsky after he falls out of favor. There's these photographs and this suddenly
we'll just call it memory holding. There is a name for it, but it's probably not a technical term in historical studies.
No.
So I brought up I'm looking at from the article. It's this social web depicting. It looks like a spider started on Adderall, and then it's on the right side, and then its Adderall wore off as it got over to the left. And so what you're describing is...
Are we talking the Babatha? The Adderall description is very good for that web. Let me just... I'm going to look at mine as well while we're talking. I see it. I have it. Yeah.
So that's depicting where there are strong ties and where there are weak ties.
Yeah, this is just depicting all of her ties. Most of them from the documents that I looked at that she saved. It's not necessarily showing who's a strong or weak tie, but it shows who's central to her. The central ones are the ones where it's like the web gets thicker. So you have one that is pretty central is Shalamzion, daughter of Judah, who is her, I'm going to say niece or daughter-in-law. It's slipping my mind right now, but she's a woman who is related to her. And so they have a lot of documents in common because, among other things, I think that they had a legal battle about custody of an orchard. So they have a lot of... So these are like documents that Babatha saved when she fled the Roman army during the Bar Kokhba revolt. And then she died in that cave. And all the civilians there died. And so there's all the documents that they saved. As they were fleeing their houses, they brought documents that were important, like documents that show their ownership of what land they own. Or she also brought a lot of documents about the legal kind of custody of her son, because she had gone through like legal struggle to change his guardianship after her husband died. So things like that she saved. And so those are the documents that I've looked at to piece together her social ties. So it's not necessarily like all of her strong ties. Some of her strongest ties are probably not in those documents, right? Because these are like legal documents and things like that are, if someone were to look at like yours or mine legal documents, they would probably, obviously like your spouse would come up in them but there would probably be many social ties that it wouldn't be a super accurate reflection of everyone of your like social circle. But my aim in recreating this is really seeing where does the centurion Megonius Valens, like how does he compare to her other ties? Because I think it's easy for us to say, after Alston and Soldier in Society in Egypt, I think it might be easier. It's easy for us to say, yes, of course, soldiers and centurions interacted with the people around them. They were often not fighting, and they were often just living there, part of the enmeshed within society. And so that's an easy but very general statement to make, right? And I think it's much harder to specify and say, okay, pause a little bit, let's back it up. How exactly are they interacting? Because it's also not a straightforward relationship, especially if you, in the case of Babatha, who's Adderall spiderweb we're looking at right now, she died fleeing from this army. So I think that kind of identifies soldiers as, I would call them, stable social ties with potential for instability, depending on the political regional factors that happen. And so it's still interesting to me exactly. I guess my question going in is really, could they form very strong ties to the civilians around them? Is that a thing that was happening? Partly we know that a lot of soldiers, many soldiers did unofficially marry before Severus, and then they were allowed to actually marry after Severus. But they had unofficial marriages. They were just not legally binding. So they marry like local women. And that's obviously a very strong tie. But when you think, I think that's the evidence I was on the hunt for, if that makes sense. And I think what I found and what I looked at two papyrological sets. Babatha and then Apollonius, a legionary Kairos in Egypt. What I found was that they're not strong ties. They're weak ties. And I think that you can read that data in different ways. Based on Luke 7 and what I was thinking in terms of a centurion patron, I was thinking through as with that in the back of my mind. I think from that perspective, the fact that these soldiers tend to have weak ties, at least in the data sets that I have looked at, with their civilians around them, makes them have great potential in terms of adopting or diffusing or being exposed to new ideas. And the reason for this is I didn't get into this in my very bad daycare analogy for trying to explain strong versus weak ties, but I'll maybe explain it better now, which is that there's a lot of research that has shown that when it comes to adopting an innovation or something new or the spread of an idea, that a weak tie is actually very potent for that. That things spread via weak ties. And that's something that maybe people will be familiar with based on all of this, what's in the news right now about the back to the workplace type things and like office dynamics, that the work from home environment is leading to less promotions and stuff like that. That's been in the news a little bit. And the reason for this is that these central like weak ties that you would form by physically being in an office location, they're not really happening when you're working from home. And those weak ties have been shown to be very effective for like things like promotion or coming into contact with new people or new ideas, getting better access to like better types of information. A lot of that, perhaps counterintuitively, comes to us through our weaker ties and not through our stronger ties, which is very interesting. So that's the perspective that I had in mind when I built these webs, these network maps that I really wanted to see. And what I found, again, was weak ties. And what that indicates is that soldiers and centurions, they were well placed to come into contact with new things, new ideas, like the Christ cult.
And did that affect, did that affect them after they left? I'm still baffled by 25 years. It took them 25 years to be done with their military service. That is...
Yeah. That one is rough, right? Yeah. It's their whole life. Think about how they didn't live as long as we did either. So that's just...
That's back when amoebic dysentery was considered the good kind of dysentery. I think that's a Jon Stewart joke from a long time ago. It's just like, and it's go fight and make sure you get through 25 years. But so when they got through their 25 years and they're in Judea and they're exposed to this new, Messiah movement, Christ cult, however you want it, Jesus movement, whatever you want to call it. Were they likely to carry it off predicated on these weak ties?
This is just the best question. Yeah, this is where the next step to this type of research, right? It's the next logical question. It's where I am right now in my research, actually. So I don't have an answer for you yet.
So that's a to be continued.
Yeah, but I do have some ideas about it, because I think that when you look at this type of information and you see how well placed they are, and you also, there's other work like Anna Koller, 2013 monograph, great, who's shown that she looked at the spread of the cult of Jupiter Dolichenos in the army, and she's shown that they are just highly effective. The military was highly effective at transmitting new ideas. Especially centurions and other officers would form what she calls these highly communicative networks. They were well acquainted with each other, often like legion to legion. They write letters. There was a postal system. They're writing to each other. They're in actual communication. And it puts them in this place. Also, they're opinion leaders. So there's a lot of sociological research that points to opinion leaders as having more sort of freedom to adopt new things. And you can see how that makes sense, right? If you have a good social standing in your community, you have less to lose by adopting something new. You have more confidence. You're not worried about being ostracized for adopting something new, because you are the trendsetter. And centurions are interesting in this regard because they were in charge of, they had several cultic responsibilities on behalf of their century, their unit within the legion that they're commanding. They offered sacrifices to the emperor on behalf of their legionaries. So they are literally cultic opinion leaders. They have that role. And I think that's where you get into, I think that this idea of like opinion leaders and transition, that's where I am right now in my research. And I think that it's too early this data is really complicated. We have to go through a lot of it to actually be able to say something at the end. So I don't have an answer But I'm very excited to have an answer about this, because I think there is a lot of good information or good data that points to, obviously the Christ cult was not popular within the Roman army in this time period, or we would see more. But so it's not necessarily, I don't want to say competing on the same level as like something like a Mithras cult or a Dolichanos situation, but it's there. We have inscriptions that show that it's there, and we also know that these soldiers did take their cultic affiliations with them as they moved around. I have a piece where it's not published yet, but I have a piece where I have tracked a legate. He's a commander over a series of inscriptions that are by some miracle all pretty clearly dated. So you can actually do this. This is pretty hard to do because you need like more than one, maybe 2 or 3 inscriptions from the same person, and you can identify they're from the same person and you can easily date them. But so I found one that I followed, and you can see him moving around the western part of the empire where he's from originally, and then when he gets stationed in North Africa, he brings his affiliations with him. He has 2 cultic affiliations that he brings with him, and so there is good evidence that they do bring them with them. And I think that opens up the pretty obvious question of, did Gaianus bring it with him, right? And what does that mean for the spread of the Jesus movement, especially when we get to some later dates when the Christianity did become popular in the army, or at least there were sort of areas like Miletos where the army where it was like the Thundering Legion and all this stuff, where there were parts of the army that did become known for affiliation with Christianity, but that's later. But it starts at some point, right? And that is just shrouded in mystery, but not as much mystery as I think that we like to think, because there are good inscriptions that are fairly early dated, like 230. Like this one, there's one from 303 CE, where it's like a funerary monument that this veteran has erected for his wife and his son, and it lists his career on their funerary monument. But he talks about his career on it, and
I rolled my eyes really big at that.
He rolled his eyes. It was a great eye roll. But he has been everywhere. It's probably some hyperbole in there, but he's very well traveled. And at the end, he says, until the resurrection. So he's Christian. And they all are. And it's public. It's 303 CE. So I think that there are good inscriptions. And John Helgeland is a good one to look into for this. He's written about these inscriptions and others. So you could be a soldier and not face public discrimination or persecution around this time, because anytime somebody makes an inscription, that is like getting onto, I don't know, the top of your house with a loudspeaker saying, "Hi, I am a member of the Jesus movement." It's like public proclamation of what you're doing. These are not like little secret places that people are like stashing like religious paraphernalia. These are public inscriptions that anyone can see, and they're meant to be seen. That's just the nature of this type of epigraphy. That's something that gets overlooked sometimes.
I think it would be an interesting question to learn the answer to. I'm not tasking you. Yeah. I'm just more thinking out loud of the tipping point between, although take it as you want, the tipping point between an inscription to, hey, thanks for the resources to help with this 4-tile mosaic, and in the midst of eulogizing my dead wife and child, I'm going to tell you about everything and indicate to you that I am of this cultic persuasion. That would be an interesting thing to learn. But it sounds like you have enough on your plate.
There is a lot, definitely. But I think that's one of the sort of conclusions I get to at the end of the JBL article, is that there's different ways that you can see this, that you can understand, you can read Gaianus. I read him as an external patron, because I think that the status, and that means that even though he's called a brother, you can also understand that within this sort of imaginary, fictive friendship language that associations would often use when speaking about a patron in order to minimize the social distance between them, because that type of social distance could create like embarrassment in antiquity for both sides, because not having a love of money was a good kind of character trait in antiquity, and not just receiving money was also a good trait. So this kind of fictive, so the use of brother for Gaianus, it could be this type of fictive friendship language and which would fit with the status difference inherent in him being a centurion and them likely being civilian, probably some military members as well, though I'm sure it was made up of both. But that status difference would have made it hard for them maybe to engage as members. Status was incredibly important in antiquity, and you generally wouldn't have a patron mingling too much with the group members. They're not general members like others, so there's a distance there. And there's other inscriptions that where it's more obvious, but that there's one very famous one for Jewish synagogue where the woman patron is, we also know from another inscription that she's a high priestess of a temple to a non-Jewish deity, not to the Jewish deity. And she is a patron to the synagogue and contributing. And there's no kind of indication that is strange, or that there's no indication that she as a patron is asked to adopt the belief in cultic exclusivity that's inherent to the early Jesus movement and to Judaism of this time, right? So I think that's the question to be asked. And, an external patron is not being asked to adopt the behavioral norms and rules of the group. But there's also cases of internal patronage was a thing in antiquity. You could be a general member of the group and also a patron. You were probably giving things on a lesser scale because there was, again, these groups generally didn't have huge amounts of social distance between them. And social distance, not social distancing, but actual distance in terms of social status is what I mean. So I argue that Gaianus is likely an external patron, and that means that he's not actually likely not expected to adhere to the kind of principle of cultic exclusivity that we generally view as part of the early Jesus movement, an important part of the early Jesus movement. Where it's difficult for scholars when they read this inscription, where it becomes tricky for us, is because it's a public association with the Jesus movement from a centurion. And we know that centurions were expected to sacrifice to the emperor on behalf of their soldiers, of their men. And so we know that they're doing this. And we also know from centurion martyrship, hagiographies from Eusebius and onwards, that they got killed, Christ-associating centurions, if they chose not to offer to the sacrifice to the emperor. So we know this is a thing that becomes an issue later on. And so what can be hard for us when we read this type of data is that he doesn't fit in. Gaianus doesn't really fit in to the molds that we already have in our minds, the status quo of how we view soldiers interacting with the Jesus movement. There's Edward Adams, for example, calls him unusual and daring, because we think when a centurion who has these other cultic obligations has this public association and proclaims himself a brother, whether fictive or real brotherhood, we think that would put him at risk of execution if we were to take Eusebius's word for it. And then that becomes very unlikely, though, because if something was dangerous, you would not write it. It's if something was dangerous for you, you would not be writing it on an inscription. That's like putting a billboard in front of your house. You wouldn't do that if that was something that could get you killed. So the nature of the evidence gets a bit overlooked. And I think it maybe has to I think when we face evidence like the Gaianus inscription and these other soldiers, I think the first step should not be, oh, they're so strange. Oh, these are so unusual. I think the first thing that we should be asking ourselves is instead questioning what this actually means about the Jesus movement. What are why do we think that they're so unusual and daring? It's because we think that they would adhere to cultic exclusivity, isn't it? That's where we think that they're strange, because we think that they're publicly advertising something about themselves that could get them killed. But what if they were not? So there's two what ifs, right? And I think both are incredibly important. The first what if is, what if the army was not that interested in what centurions and soldiers were doing with their cultic lives? Obviously, that changes during Diocletian, and that's where we have these so-called Diocletianic persecutions, and that's also when Diocletian had developed this kind of policy of making sure that everybody was sacrificing to the emperor, and there was some monitoring that was going on there, and that produces these centurion martyrship hagiographies. But prior to Diocletian, That was a new thing that he was doing because everything was going wrong for him. Plagues, losses, and everything. And he wanted to get the gods back on his side. So he's like, everybody has to do this. And that's where that policy comes from. But we're taking that reality, the post-Diocletianic reality, and we're applying it to the period before. And that actually makes no sense because there's a reason why Diocletian felt the need to start this monitoring, right? Because it wasn't there prior. And so I think that's an important what if. I don't think that the army really cared that much about what the individual soldiers were doing with their personal cultic lives and their cultic affiliations prior to Diocletian. And then I think the other what if is, what if not all Christ groups expected cultic exclusivity, right? Because that's a big assumption that we have, that every single Christ group in antiquity expected all its members not to participate in any other form of cultic worship or rituals. What if that wasn't the case? It's a question that should be asked. There was a lot of diversity in the Jesus movement in the early years. And even something that is biblical. Take a 1 Peter, for example, where it says that you should honor the emperor with the same Greek words that are used to describe cultically honoring the emperor. And there's scholarly debate on this, but there are respectable, very smart people that believe that is actually that's loosening a little bit of this. It's enabling congregation members, or congregation is the wrong word, but it's enabling Christ group members to participate in the cultic life of the city in a way that would not make them stand out, if that makes sense, not open them up to persecution.
Man, you're a troublemaker because you're trying to get me. If we go down this road, I'm gonna go for a second hour, and I know you don't have that much time. It's much later where you are than it is. Yeah. Okay.
I am good for a bit more time, but yes, you're right. I do have a cutoff.
But okay, I'm gonna cut you off there on new material though, and because I want to get to what would you have people read to get a better understanding of this type of relationship or network of relationships in that world when they come across a passage like Luke 7, 1-10.
Yeah. So good. Okay. First of all, I would have people read John Kloppenborg's Christ's Associations. I think that one is seminal. And not just because he's my supervisor. I think it is a very important book. And it summarizes and encompasses a lot of very important association research over the years. And as well, it is just great at explaining the role of social network theory in theorizing this stuff and how it can be helpful to us, because sometimes that gets a bit misunderstood. And I think that John does a great job, obviously. He does a great job of explaining that in a way that is both, because it's complicated, but he does a great job of explaining it and in a way where you could see how you could apply it to your own research as well. And so I think Christ Associations is a must read for this type of stuff. He talks about patronage in there, a great chapter. I think obviously I want to give recs that are specific, like that will specifically help with the Luke 7 passage. I would say that Soldier in Society in Egypt, I've mentioned Alston a few times, but this is not like biblical scholarship, but it is in class. It's a classics read, but it's great. Soldier in Society in Egypt, Roman Egypt, by Richard Alston. I think if you want to understand a little bit more about the centurion's role, there's also Christopher Fuhrmann, and I'm not remembering exactly the title of the book, but it is about policing, like centurions as a type of police presence, policing in Roman Egypt again. And I think that his work is really great when trying to understand, how the centurion in Luke 7 was like duties could we expect that he had in his day-to-day life? How did he become enmeshed with these local elders that are appealing on his behalf? And also, I think, to help us understand how Luke wants to portray, because there's one side, what does narrative in the story, what does it mean? But there's also a perspective of like, why is Luke using, because Luke also in Acts 10 will go on to use Cornelius in very specific ways. And at the end of Acts, also, Luke has a centurion take Paul to Rome. So centurions are important for Luke's storytelling and for his narrative progression, and he uses them in specific ways. And I think for that question, there's a great monograph, Alexander Kuroshenko, The Roman Army and the Expansion of the Gospel, from 2014. That one is a good read. And I think he speaks more on a level of the kind of narrative function of Centurions, but that's also very important. It's also very important. I do think that things, though, change when you know that they're not just narrative inventions or tools, right? Because I think that what I hope that my research kind of contributes is an understanding that I'm not saying that like the Centurion in Luke 7 was real. That's not what I'm saying. Who knows? But that's not my point. My point is that there existed at this time or time periods close to this actual centurions who were associating with Christ groups. And that definitely blew my mind when I first discovered it, that because it kind of flies in the face of what our field writes about how the Jesus movement interacted with the Roman army during this time period pre-Constantine. So I think that changes things, that these men actually existed and they left inscriptions and that describe their affiliation in various ways. So I think Kuroshenko's book is great and everyone should read it. But I also think that when you look at it not only from a narrative perspective, you look at them not only as narrative tools, but you also see, okay, this is a social dynamic that was not unrealistic, that is being written about. What does it say about Luke's military knowledge? What does it mean that he has a pretty okay military knowledge? And what does it mean that these are positive characters? Because, and this will be like the last thing I say on this very long book rec, that generally ancient literature depicted centurions like very negatively. So that's something you could just Google ancient Roman authors on centurions and you will just get a bunch of plays and writings. Ovid has some where centurions as characters are almost only negative. They are just mean, they take money, they're sexually promiscuous, they're everything bad to a Roman audience. And here you have Luke writing about them very positively. And so that's definitely noteworthy. And what does it mean? He's using them in a way that's different from how other ancient authors generally will use centurions.
I like
so the last was just a Google search. So
yeah, look it up, guys. I like a long book recommendation. One more, and what do you read for fun?
Yeah. What do I read for fun? Oh my gosh. What do I read for fun? You know what? I recently have been reading this amazing book called You Must Never Touch a Tiger. I read children's books for fun to my children.
Any book is a children's book if the child can read.
That's just like literally the last book I read to my 18-month-old. No, he's 16 months old. But yeah, no, I am trying very hard after having kids because I have two kids, they're 2 years apart. So they're both so young. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. So I'm trying to read. That's not for work, but it ends up being children's books. I'm not going to lie. But you know what? I'm going to go with that theme. And I will say that what I am reading for fun right now is Each Peach Pear Plum, because that is my son's favorite book. And it's excellent. Can highly recommend.
I bet it is. Yeah. There are no children young enough in my house to want me to read to them, but that was one of my favorite things when my son was little. There was one of my favorite, I'll throw this out there. It's the monster at the end of this book, I think is what it's called.
Oh, my kids love that book. Oh my gosh.
That's the only book I did a voice for.
Yes.
Everything else I read as daddy.
He's amazing. If everyone is screaming and everyone is having a tantrum, I will just pull out the monster at the end of this book. And the boys are just like, but who is the monster at the end of this book? Every time.
There is a monster at the end of this book?
But it's Grover. Yeah, it's a great book. Great book. At some point I will have time to read where it's not research or children's book, but that time is probably 10 years in the future. But you know what? I am loving this time of life. I think that so many people, and women especially, will say that talk about the negative parts of having small kids and trying to get all this work done. But you know what? I actually love it. I think it's lovely to have kids around all the time. And it's fun. You get to explain things to them on their level. They challenge you. I think it's a great combination. So if there's any like female PhD students out there who are wondering if it's like they will manage if they have kids during these years, you will. And you know what? It doesn't have to be as scary as really gets talked down. It really does. And I think that's a shame because it actually can work as well for you as it works for all these male PhD students that have kids and nobody questions it. So that's just a PSA for everyone. I've always wanted to say that.
here's my PSA, and this is to any parent listening at all. There will come a day when you get snuggles for the last time, and you do not know what that day is.
Oh my God.
Soak it up. If you don't have anything else for us, I will call this one.
I'm all out. Yeah.
I really appreciate you being here. This was super fun.
Thank you. Thank you for just letting me speak about what I'm always thinking about. So thank you.
Okay. Take care.
You too. Bye.